Protesters in Minneapolis and, of course, elsewhere say that George Floyd's death fits a general pattern of police brutality against black men in America. And this is not the first time, is it, that there's been national outrage over the treatment of African-American citizens at the hands of the police?
Absolutely, Laura. It's part of an ongoing pattern, according to many of the protesters, and not just the black community in America, but many civil rights activists and others who see this as part of a trend of systemic injustice when it comes to black men, especially young black men, at the hands of police forces across America. Racial profiling, the excessive use of force. The comparison that is being made perhaps most prominently is to Eric Garner. You might remember that name from 2014. He was a black man who was put in a chokehold by a police officer on the Manhattan borough of Staten Island. And he said the exact same words that we hear George Floyd saying on the video that went viral, which is, "I can't breathe," which also became a rallying cry for protesters. That man, Eric Garner, died shortly after pleading with officers saying he can't breathe, as did George Floyd in this latest incident. And in both cases, you have a very angry sense among many of these protesters that nothing really changes in the aftermath of these incidents. And even when you don't have videos going viral or instances of chokeholds being applied, you have incidents such as the recent case of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. He went running. He was just jogging out in a suburb in the state of Georgia. He was pursued, chased by two white men, and he was shot, and he ended up dying. There was another case, Breonna Taylor. These names just keep on coming. Breonna Taylor was a medical technician in the state of Kentucky. Police entered her home on a no-knock warrant. That means they just busted in. She ended up being shot as well and dying. The list literally goes on. I don't even have to mention perhaps the flag bearer, the standard bearer case when you talk about these cases. Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Almost everyone now knows his name. It's become a household name. He too was killed by police in one of these incidents. Another case perceived as young black men dying unjustly with the excessive use of force by police officers across America using too much force and violating essentially their constitutional rights. And that includes their rights, their civil rights, their civic rights, not to have excessive force used against them.
And what then, Doug, about the response from Donald Trump? He's been very vocal on Twitter today. Has he poured fuel on the flames?
He has, factually he has, in the sense that, in the past, he has not actually, surprisingly perhaps, tweeted about these incidents of police brutality or perceived police brutality against young black men. This time he waded in, denouncing the protesters as thugs and also seeming to threaten the use of lethal force. Now, why do I say that? You mentioned that Twitter has basically placed a public interest notice on one of his tweets saying that Donald Trump broke the platform's policies about, quote, the glorification of violence. What they're referring to is Donald Trump's last line in that tweet, where he basically talks about the specific use when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Is that inadvertent or is it unintentional? It is a clear parallel, a historic parallel to a tweet by a former Miami police officer back in December 1967. We're going back more than half a century, where the Miami police chief basically tweeted the exact same thing, that when the looting starts, the shooting starts. And he was saying that. He wasn't tweeting at the time, obviously, but the Miami police chief said it at the time ahead of the Republican National Convention. He was essentially unveiling what he called a new get tough policy on policing black, yes, specifically black neighborhoods. And he said that he was ready to bring out the shotguns, the dogs, and an aggressive stop and frisk policy in order to reduce crime in these black areas. Now, did Donald Trump specifically allude to that incident in his tweet? No, he didn't. But it is hard not to see a clear historical analogy and parallel between that latest Trump tweet and this tweet by a former, what is clearly a racist former police officer of Miami back over half a century ago, using the exact same wording that Donald Trump did.
Let's talk about what happens now, or what might happen now. The 4 police officers who were involved in George Floyd's death have been fired. Are we likely to see prosecutors press charges?
Right now, the prosecutors say officially that they're weighing the evidence, deliberating. They have to, let legal concerns be carefully weighed. They can't let emotions and protests weigh on their judgment. That they are trying to mount a robust criminal investigation. The FBI in Minneapolis, the U.S. Attorney's Office, also saying the same thing, mounting a robust criminal investigation. Those are their words into this death and whether or not it constituted under federal law a violation of George Floyd's civil rights. Now, you might roll your eyes and say that is ludicrous. How could it not have violated his civil rights? It killed him. But they are taking the very strictly legalistic approach, saying they have to weigh and balance all of the evidence. Look, a lot of people are going to be pessimistic about this, saying that in the past, officers involved in similar high-profile cases of perceived police brutality against young black men, they've been let off, including the officer in the Eric Garner case, the chokehold case that I mentioned earlier. So is hope high that the officers will be charged? We can't say. Perhaps the political context and the extra pressure being applied, the fact that the governor of the state of Minnesota, the mayor of Minneapolis himself have made very strong statements in favor. Perhaps that will also have a political influence on some of the decisions on how this case is treated going forward. But for now, none of those officers have been charged. 4 were involved. The one that they would consider immediately perhaps bringing a charge again would be one of the officers, the one who was seen on this video as pinning George Floyd to the ground using his knee to press his neck to the ground before he died. That one officer perhaps would be most likely to have a charge brought against him. But then again, the 3 other officers who attended this arrest of George Floyd preceding his death, they did nothing. At least not on the video that we see. They did nothing to intervene or to stop their fellow officer from applying what turned out to be deadly force, excessive use of deadly force as they made this arrest.
Douglas, thank you very much. Douglas Herbert there.